Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Donna Green, and you're listening to Real Relatable. When you want to change the criminal justice system, what better way than working on the inside? We've interviewed a Black law enforcement officer to get their perspective on the side of the arrest, and now it's time to delve into what happens after the arrest. This episode, we sit down with someone who lives and breathes criminal justice in the pursuit to change it for the better. They have earned both an MA and PhD in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati and currently works in the field. Please welcome Dr. Charlene Taylor to the podcast. Hey, Charlene.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'm so glad that we met about a year ago at this point, as we rallied in this Facebook group surrounding the insane political climate that we were in and just all of the tensions that were there. And so now, as someone I consider a friend, I'm really grateful to have you join the podcast and pick your brain a little bit more than usual.
Well, cool. I'm ready.
Perfect. So what was it like for you growing up? Like, were there things that you noticed that maybe sparked your interest in the criminal justice world?
Well, I grew up like most kids of the 70s and 80s watching a ton of television. And during that time, there were a lot of like law shows, like a lot of police shows and a lot of lawyer shows. And so I grew up from the time I was pretty little wanting to be a lawyer. I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer, and I vacillated between I want to be a defense attorney and then I want to be a prosecutor. And but I was always fascinated with the legal system, with the courts, and just with prisons and sort of like what happens to people when they start to get caught up in that system. And I didn't really have many friends or family members or anything that were criminal justice involved, but it was just something that from what I could see on the news and what I saw in different television shows, it just seems like the system wasn't a great one and that there were people inside the system that needed someone to work for them.
Yeah, and someone to be like an advocate kind of thing.
Yeah. And I didn't know after I decided, well, first it was a lawyer, then I was like, maybe I don't want to be a lawyer. I don't know. I knew I wanted to do something criminal justice related. I didn't know exactly what that was going to look like. But yeah, I just always knew I was always drawn to it, especially the prison side. I wasn't all that interested in policing. I never have been, but definitely like the prison and jail side, I was sort of drawn to it.
Interesting. And I'm not sure if I remember this correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong, but were either of your parents in the military?
Yes. Yeah. My dad was in the military. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do you think what branch of the military?
Army.
Okay. I guess it's not exactly like criminal justice, but I don't know. I just thought about that. I'm like, I wonder if there might be some relation if maybe they were like an officer of sorts, like, or, you know.
I don't know. He wasn't. He worked in finance.
Okay.
But my mother worked in human resources for the federal government, for the FAA. And one of the things, even before I had decided I wanted to be a lawyer, I knew I wanted to be some sort of businesswoman so that I could wear suits and high heel shoes and carry a briefcase like my mom.
Yeah. So. And probably like some of those women on the shows that you're watching too.
LA Law was my favorite show for years, for years. So,
was Law and Order even around then? I know it's been on for like eons at this point, but
not when I was a kid.
Oh, okay.
I think it might have started when I was in high school. But it's been on forever. But no, Law and Order was the big one. And or not Law and Order, I'm sorry. LA Law. That was the big one that I watched all the time and just was like, I could do that. Like I could be a lawyer. And so that was my goal until I got to college and had a conversation with a professor who kind of talked me out of law school and into graduate school. And I, at the time I didn't even really know why they called professors doctor. Like I knew what a PhD was. I knew there were, but my parents didn't go to college. And so I didn't, have a lot of background. And he, we were talking, we spent 2.5 hours in his office. One day I walked in to ask a question and 2.5 hours later, I walked out with a whole new life plan.
Wow.
And he was like,
what was that conversation like? Obviously very life-changing, as you sort of pivot into this different direction, but what was the difference that they saw that they were like, okay, you should do this instead?
So he pointed out that, so I walked into his office to ask about a class I needed something for, and I was a transfer student. And so he was like, and I was in his class. He said, you're pretty smart. What do you plan on doing after graduation? And I said, law school. And he goes, oh, don't do that. That's a terrible idea. And I was like, what? No one had ever said law school is a terrible idea.
Yeah.
But he said, you'll work way too hard for way too little money. And there's way too many people in law school right now. What do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to do criminal justice stuff. And he said, well, have you thought about graduate school? I was like, no, I don't even really know what you're talking about. And so he, sort of explained, master's degree and the different things, the different doors that would open. And he suggested that I get a PhD. And he said, you can teach criminal justice, you can study criminal justice, and you have a much more flexible schedule. He's like, do you plan to have kids? Do you want to be home when they get home from school? Be a professor.
Wow.
So there was definitely some element of that was appealing. And so I decided to go, for a while I was going to do both. I was going to do a joint degree program of getting a law degree and a PhD at the same time. And I don't like to live my life with regrets, but if I have one regret, it is that I let people talk me out of that. Because everyone I mentioned, everyone was like, oh my God, that's too hard. Are you kidding? You can't do that. I absolutely could have done it.
Yeah.
I mean, and I should have, because I really still wanted to go to law school, even though I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. But the work that I did in graduate school really is what really changed my life. I started working for a professor and doing training and consulting for probation departments and prisons and jails. And it was then that I realized that I started to figure out what my career might look like, and how I might be able to contribute to the criminal justice system without actually being a probation officer or working inside a prison.
Yeah, and that's got to be a really hard sort of thing I guess you almost like the boots on the ground of being in the prison system. And I mean, my knowledge of it is so, it's maybe kind of like how when you were a kid, you're watching these shows. This is now this show on Netflix called Jailbirds that I've watched a few seasons of and been like, wow, this is so messed up. So that's my sort of juvenile reference, if you will, of the criminal justice system. And then, just listening to different podcasts or reading different articles or, reading about things that happen in the news and kind of learning in that way. And so it's not as I don't know, as in touch maybe as it would be if you're physically there and seeing it every single day. That seems like it'd be so exhausting.
It's hard. I mean, I did during my undergraduate work, I went to Washington State, and all the criminal justice majors were required to do an internship. So I did an internship at Lewiston, Idaho Probation and Parole. And I spent my entire summer in the probation office. And they, at the time, had never had an intern before. So they didn't realize that most internships only let the kids make copies and make coffee for people and not really do anything fun. And so they paired me with a probation officer, and, I sort of shadowed him for a couple of weeks. And then a month in, he gave me 5 people on his caseload that he called my little mini caseload. So when they came in, I would be the one who would lead the conversations. I got to go into the bathroom and watch women pee in a cup for their urinalysis. I got to write violation reports. I got to go with him to go find people who had absconded from probation. And so by the end of the summer, I really felt like I knew what the life of a probation officer would be like. And I thought, there's no way. Because by the end of the summer, 4 of the 5 people on my mini caseload had returned to jail. Because of different violations or
by violating or committing or just committing another crime, or maybe that's the same thing. I don't know.
It can be. Only one of the 4 actually committed a new crime. The other 3 just repeatedly violated their conditions of probation. So they're technical violations, but when you get so many of them, they will eventually revoke your probation and send you back to jail. And it was just so hard. Bill, he was the guy that I worked with, Bill Schrupp. And he used to tell me that I was working too hard. He's like, you're here to help and support them. You're not supposed to work harder than the people on your caseload. And, I was going home and researching different jobs and, all these different things. And he was like, that's not your job to do. That's their job to do. Yours is to be support. And so I realized by the end of the summer that that kind of work was just too draining on me emotionally. I was so worried about them all the time. I was I remember I cried a couple days. It was too hard. And so when I got to graduate school and realized that I could be a person who offered something to the people who worked with those people. So I knew I didn't want to work in probation and parole or work in the prison. But if I had something to offer that could help those people who do those jobs do them better, have better outcomes for the people that they work with, then that was going to be my way of contributing without actually having to be on the front lines.
Yeah. And that emotional load, it's almost like you're taking it from them onto you, almost like this mother sort of figure, whereas they need to do that on their own. And I would be the same way. I'd be like, oh my gosh, well, we need to do all of these sorts of things to get you at a better place. But in reality, these are adults likely, that you're dealing with. But it's interesting, like, I'd be so curious to know, had you gone that route of probation, what would that be like now? Like, is there, I feel like this has to happen in those sorts of careers where you not just deal with people, but deal with people in these very life-changing sorts of ways. Even if you were like a surgeon or in this criminal justice world too, working in the prisons, like at what point do you start to dissociate that these are people? You know what I mean? Like that seems like something that you would have to be able to flip off, because that would drive, I don't know, I couldn't perform surgery and cut people open, or lock people up.
It's so strange because I think you have to be able to do both. You have to be able to dissociate from the personal relationships with people and be able to set those boundaries. But you can't lose lose your humanity and lose sight of the fact that these are still people. And yes, they're people who have done bad things. Yes, they're people that we lock up in cages like animals, but they're not animals. They're people. And they're people who are going to go back out into the community and perhaps be your neighbor. And so that's what I always say when I talk to people about prison and prison reform, because lots of people are like, well, they did something bad. They deserve it. Like they don't need any rights. They don't need any, extra amenities. And my response is always, when someone goes into prison, they're 9 times out of 10, actually more than that, something like 95% of people who go into prison eventually get out at some point. So who do you want to come out on the other side? Do you want the same person who went in? Do you want a better person or a worse person? Because what we're doing now, at best, gives us the same person. At worst, gives us a worse person. But we know how to do things better to give us a better person who comes out on the other side. And that's the part where, yes, it takes some work on their part and on the part of the people who work inside the system. But it's worth it. It's worth it to give them a better shot at having a better life when they get out on the outside and improving communities. And so, it goes from the individual level all the way up. So I think that piece of working one-on-one with folks every day really requires a delicate balance of keeping boundaries so that you don't get too interpersonally close with people, but also retaining your humanity and understanding that these are still people and they need help and support like anybody else would.
Wow. That's like really profound. I never thought about it in that way and not that I've like thought negatively. Well, I'm not going to lie. Like I might have thought negative things, but I've never really encountered people like to know otherwise or to like say anything, but I wouldn't judge them either. Like, I think it's natural to have a thought, but acting on it is a different sort of thing. So I think that's where I am.
I think a great experience for anyone is and it's hard to do this as just like a lay person, but because I taught corrections for so many years, I used to take my students on tours of the prison or jail, whatever was close. And I always told them, if you think you want to work inside a facility, you need to go inside one. Because it's you can think that you know what it's going to feel like, but there's something that happens inside you when you walk through a big iron door and you hear it close and lock behind you. And you realize that you are not going to be out unless someone presses a button and lets you out. Oh. And even if you work in there's something that happens in your body when you realize you are locked inside someplace. And, when I would take my students, I always struggled, well, not always, but after a few years, I started to struggle with the decision to take them on these tours, because on the one hand, we're walking through these prisons, which is where people live, and, sort of almost looking at them like they're animals in a cage. you
Yeah,
know?
that
And
was
so
my
that
actual first thought
felt,
that came through. I wondered if they were in their cells as their
yeah. And I mean, sometimes if you take them to the county jail, I mean, people are taking showers, people are, going to the bathroom, and there's no doors. There's no curtains. Like there's very little privacy in prisons and jails. So
yeah.
we're walking by and I would tell my students, I'm like, you're walking through someone's home. Yes, it's a jail, but this is where these people live. So be respectful, And so, but ultimately I decided that it was more worth it for the people. If I was teaching people who may eventually go to work in those environments, they need to be able to understand what it's like and then come back to my class and debrief and talk about that and talk about the necessity of keeping your humanity when you're a person who essentially works as someone who's holding other people in cages. Like you really have to be careful to not start to see them as less than people and less than human. But I think it's an amazing experience if you have the opportunity to go walk through a jail, because there's something that happens inside you when that door locks, and it's profound.
It feels profound just thinking about it in the way that you described it. Like literally, I had chills and I'm like clutching my pearls because I couldn't even imagine.
And I mean, I've been in more prisons than I can count at this point. And they're not, and I didn't feel, it's not about having the door lock and feeling unsafe. It wasn't that, but it's its own world. It really is. It's its own world with, to some degree, its own rules. And like, it's a different environment. And the things that happen on the outside, those same rules don't always apply. Yeah. And so, I mean, I've imagined that from the perspective, because every time I walk into a prison, I know I'm leaving. I'm leaving at the end of the day, but I've thought about that feeling of when the first time someone gets sentenced to prison and walks in and looks around, hears that door lock and thinks, I'm not getting out for years of your life in this like self-contained environment that is inherently dangerous given the people that are in there. And just sort of the powder keg nature of having all these people in a small confined environment that's very restrictive. And it's all kinds of different people. And I imagine that initial feeling has to be, it's got to be really daunting, especially when you're looking down, staring down the barrel of 5 years or 10 years, and not knowing at all if you're going to ever be able to get out again. And in my conscious mind, it never bothered me. I never felt scared, or at least I didn't think I did. I never felt scared. I was not like, in fact, the most nervous I ever was in a prison was actually in a women's prison, because that is the place I got the worst cat calls. The things that those women were saying to me, I was like, and I'm not a delicate flower. What? I was just like, oh my God, stop talking to me like that. I was like 20, I think it was like 22, and I was like 22 or 23, and I was like, oh my God, I've never heard such things. But the men in prisons are always super respectful, always super respectful. The women is a little bit scarier. So I went to a women's facility in California. We were doing a program evaluation. And so I spent the whole day there. I shadowed some of the people who worked there. I sat actually in a group with a bunch of women, most of whom were there for like life sentences or very long sentences. And they had been there for a long time. That's one of the most pro-social group of people I've ever met in my life. Like most of those women that were there for killing abusive spouses in that particular group that I was in. Yeah. And there were women that had gone through courts in the 70s and 80s. And so they got all, before battered women syndrome and like a better understanding of how that whole cycle of abuse works. So anyway, that was a great group, but I didn't, as I was going through my day there, I didn't feel weird. I didn't feel anxious. I didn't feel anything. I was also 4 months pregnant. So I was at that stage where I didn't look pregnant, and I wasn't really telling people yet. Yeah. So no one knew. And I was there all day, and I got home, or got in the car to drive away, and my neck and my back just like spasmed. I didn't realize it until I was out of the last door and I was in my car and about to drive away, that I had been holding my body in this like tense posture the entire time I was in there. And I think for me, because that had never happened to me before, and the only thing that I can attribute it to is the fact that I was pregnant. And it, just that sort of maternal protective sort of thing that happens. But it was really interesting because for the first time in my career, and at that point I had been, that was probably like 8 or 9 years ago. So I've been doing this for a good, almost, 10, 15 years. At that point, it was the first time ever that I said, I don't want to go back to a prison. It was the first time I ever had that thought of like, the feeling that I had in my body, I didn't want to have again.
Yeah.
And like I said, I do think a lot of it had to do with being pregnant, but there's something, like I said, there's something about walking into a place and having a door locked behind you and knowing that you are not getting out, not even if you just want to. Somebody on the other side of a big steel wall has to see you through a TV camera and press a button so that you can open that door. Yeah. And if that doesn't happen, you're not going anywhere. Yeah. And there's something that feels different. And I think people, especially the students I would talk to, I'm like, you need to understand what that feeling is before you apply for a job where you get there and after the first week you realize you can't take it.
Right.
Because, and it might not even be the work, it might not be the people, but that feeling of being locked in is really hard for some people.
Yeah. Probably most people.
Yeah. I mean, I do think you have to, I think it takes a special kind of person to work inside a facility. And I think it takes an even more special type of person to do it well. Mm-hmm. Because you have to be able to establish those boundaries and keep your humanity. Mm-hmm. And I think that is one of the hardest tightropes to walk in a profession.
I think that's probably part of the issue too, is that they've lost their humanity,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because it's really easy, back to that us versus them thing, the putting up the boundaries thing, that's the easy part. Yeah. It's like, you can't get too close to them. You don't have like these personal conversations and don't share information and, all of these pieces. And so that's the easy part. The hard part is retaining that humanity. Mm-hmm. The hard part is saying, no, we're not friends, but I care about you as a person and my job is to help you. Mm. And so retaining that piece without kind of crossing boundaries, I think can be really hard for people. Yeah. I wouldn't be good at it. I know I wouldn't be good at it.
Absolutely not. No, I would be horrible. I would get fired in the first week.
I would be terrible.
They would be like, you should not be here.
You can't be here.
No.
Yeah, I would be terrible at it. So yeah, I hope that the work that I do ultimately helps people who are justice involved. That mm-hmm. either things I do directly or things that I do to work with folks who work with people directly. Mm-hmm. I hope that the work I do helps them have a better experience, a more productive experience in the system if they're going to be stuck in it, and that it helps them get out and have a more productive life on the other side.
I have no doubt that it is.
Ultimately, I want to help people.
Yeah.
And the system is broken, and it's not going to get fixed by ignoring the parts that are broken and letting it just be more filled up with people who don't understand how its brokenness. Right. The only way it's going to be fixed is to have people inside it who understand that it's broken mm-hmm. and who are committed to trying to fix it.
Yeah. And that reminds me of, I forgive my ignorance here, but there is this documentary on Netflix about Khalif Browder. Do you know about that case, or did you watch the?
Yes, I'm somewhat familiar. Yeah, I didn't watch the documentary though.
Yeah, so he, I'm just going to read this from this article real quick. So he's an African-American youth from the Bronx, New York, and was held at Rikers Island jail complex without trial between 2010 and 2013 for allegedly stealing a backpack containing valuables. His imprisonment, Browder was in solitary confinement for 2 years. And when I was watching the documentary, it was just this really heartbreaking story about how there's no real evidence that he sold this backpack, and he's in Rikers Island, right? And just learning about how to survive, you literally have to defend yourself physically from the people that are around you. And being put into solitary confinement, I can't remember how long it was, but it was, what was it? I feel like it was like the better part of a year that he was in solitary confinement or something like that. And just this insane amount of time. And then you start to literally sort of lose your mind. And
absolutely.
Yeah. And it's just really sad that, he goes through all of this over the course of, a few years. And then ultimately, I believe he ended his own life from the trauma of that,
Yeah.
And it's so hard to even like conceptualize that as someone who's totally removed from that. But I could imagine that being on the inside would be something that you similarly deal with in a way if you're going to work literally inside a prison or, maybe even if had you gone that probation route.
Yeah, it was. And that was one of the things, I knew after visiting a few of them that I didn't want to work inside a prison because that feeling, that anxiety, that angst that you carry, I didn't want to carry that every day because there is because if you think about it, like in people who are incarcerated to some degree allow themselves to be incarcerated. And they allow themselves, and I say that because the sheer numbers of people in prison, in any jail, if the prisoners all decided one day, like, screw it, we're taking over this joint, they outnumber the people who work there by a lot. Yeah. It would be messy and ugly, but eventually they could probably take over.
That's fair.
So there's this delicate balance of like, you're out, as the person who works there, you are outnumbered by a lot. So there's this balance of sort of like keeping enough of a peace so that the people who live there let you keep that peace. Like I'm not explaining it very well.
No, it totally makes sense.
Yeah, it's a whole different environment in there, and it's really it makes sense that people have such a hard time reintegrating into society when they get back, the longer that they spend in prison, because it's not like, it's not like the outside world. And last year during the pandemic, when we been on lockdown for a long time, you saw all these memes and then different people talking about things and comparing the lockdown to being in prison. And my first response was just like, I've never even been in prison, and that pisses me off.
Yeah.
Like it's not even comparable, because you're in lockdown and you're not supposed to go anywhere. But anytime you get ready, you can open the door and you can go where you want to go. And it really just minimizes the emotional impact that being incarcerated has when you draw that kind of false comparison.
100%.
I understand nobody wanted to be on lockdown. Nobody wanted to just be stuck at home. But it's a different thing when you're not just stuck at home. But imagine like not just stuck at home, but stuck in your bathroom, the size of your bathroom. And that's where you are all the time. And that's where you eat, and that's where you sleep. And that's where, that's just, I read an article about a professor that had students do that and journal about it over the weekend.
Wow.
And I don't think any of them actually lasted the entire weekend.
I can't imagine. Because you have that free will to open the door.
You have the ability to open. And even in that artificial situation, even if somebody did last the whole weekend, you still know in the back of your mind that at any time you get ready, you can open the door. You can open the door and walk out. And that taking that piece away from people, I think really changes how they interact with the everyday world. Because losing that kind of autonomy, it just changes you. I think it just changes you.
Wow. I'm just like absorbing everything, because I really hadn't, I don't know. It just feels, it's heavy, but like because of the perspective, which I would hope other people feel that as well, or might like either change or improve their thought processes when they think about people who have been incarcerated. I
the story
I'm just
you
at a
were
loss for
talking
words.
about. Yeah, no. And, the story you were talking about makes it, what makes that even more tragic is that he wasn't convicted. It was, that story highlights so many failures of the criminal justice system, not the least of which is this backwards ass bail system that we have that ends up locking people up because they can't afford to get out before trial.
Right.
And, it's, and the really problematic part of that is that the burden of that and the likelihood of being stuck in prison falls disproportionately on people who are already poor. And it just starts this like avalanche of negative things. I mean, think about it. Like if I got arrested tomorrow, today's Friday, I got arrested tomorrow, I'm in jail over the weekend. And let's say I couldn't make bail. So I missed work on Monday, missed work on Tuesday, probably don't have any way of getting a hold of my employers, but I missed work for, let's say 3 days, maybe 4 days before I'm able to once I'm able to get back in touch with them, I probably wouldn't have lost my job. Probably, maybe I would have, but I probably wouldn't have.
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't have lost my apartment or my house or, whatever. But if I'm working a minimum wage job and I don't show up for work on Monday, my job is gone. So by the time I get out, my job is gone, which probably means my house is gone. If I have children, there's, a piece there. Hopefully there was somebody else at the house. There's just this avalanche of consequences that disproportionately negatively impact people who are poor. If you have money and you get arrested, you can get out generally, unless it's something that's like really violent. Right. You can get out before it really impacts your life. Before it really has this sort of ripple effect on all the different areas of your life. If you're poor, it's not the same thing. Yeah. It's a completely, and so the same act, the same circumstance, getting arrested has completely different impacts on people's lives depending on where they are socioeconomically. And that in and of itself tells you that the system is broken. It's broken from Jump Street. It's broken from the moment you enter the system. It is set up to have this cascading, this cascading list of negative consequences that are just exacerbated at every stage for people who are poor.
And it's like the crack versus cocaine sort of thing where, people, crack is associated with, Black and brown communities and however it's not ingested, but however you take the drug versus cocaine, which is more, predominant in like white communities and with the affluent, quote unquote. So with them, like cocaine, you don't get maybe as harsh of a sentence or as harsh of a fine versus crack, which will, do worse. You'll get a longer sentence for less, Yeah.
It's, and it's, going back to the why of my work. I mean, that's been, as I've gotten older, going through college, through graduate school, and just learning, the more I learned about the system, the more committed I became to being a person who works inside it to change it. I've never desired to get to work inside the criminal justice system just to be another piece of this puzzle. Right. From the beginning, I've always endeavored to have the system do things differently, and on in different ways and on different stages. But yeah, that's always been my goal, is to make the system, to make it better. I mean, unfortunately, we can't just blow it all up and start over. That would be ideal. We can't do that. So short of blowing it all up and starting over, we have to work within it to make it work better for the people who are inevitably going to be affected by it. People are going to continue to commit crime. They're going to continue to get arrested. What we can do is try to change what happens once those gears start turning. Once things start get get underway in the criminal justice system, how can we make it as effective to do what it's supposed to do, which is control crime, without adding on so many of these negative consequences of the way that it does that, and disproportionately negative consequences. How do we make it do what it's supposed to do in a way that's fair, in a way that's just? And, how do we even decide what that means?
Yeah. What brings you the most joy from this work? Like, what are your highlights of everything that you've done in your career?
I think two things. The first thing, when you first ask that question, the thing that gives me the most joy, I've done a lot of consulting and training with especially probation and parole officers. And, I've spent a lot of time doing research, conducting research and reading research about like what works and how we can most effectively help people in the correction system. And so there's a lot of stuff that we know works. And if you do it, and if you do it well, you have a much more positive impact on the people that you supervise if you're a probation parole officer. So when I do trainings and I come back and, someone says, yeah, I tried that thing that you taught me and it worked. Like this thing, to actually hear people say that they're doing things differently and they're getting different and better outcomes. That is, that's what I live for that, in that work. And then, and creating things that I believe will provide better outcomes for people in the system. So I helped create a program for these youth reporting centers in West Virginia. We evaluated all 15 of the centers and then completely redesigned their program. And that's one of my proudest moments of my career, because I think it was a really good program. Now, what happens in terms of implementation and down the road, that part's out of my hands. Yeah. But putting that together, I really felt like it was a good program. And it was a program that had a good chance of having positive impact on the juveniles who went through it. So
that's beautiful. I love that, because it's not just something that's tangible to be able to do and implement, but also something that like you see the fruits of your labor with, in a sense. So I think that's really beautiful. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Charlene. Every time we get into these conversations, I learn something new, and I have definitely learned a lot more today. And
I can talk about this stuff for hours.
And I love it though. It's really insightful and really just changes the perspective, even if it's just a bit more than maybe what you've already known. I think this will really help for everyone listening, and definitely for me as well. What would be your call to action? What would you implore people to do to help create change?
It's a really great question. I think the first thing is to learn. You have to understand the system before you can sort of think about what you want to do to change it, and get active. I think, all of these systems are responsive to people paying attention. I think, when we think about criminal justice reform, the front end of that is police reform. And so we have these, police citizen advisory boards and things like that. And that's because that's the part of criminal justice that we see. Everybody has contact with police officers, whether it's just asking for directions or getting pulled over for a ticket or something. So it's easy to get involved there. The deeper you get into the system, the less and less people can see it. And so people know very little about what happens inside prisons. And the more people learn about what happens inside prisons, they're appalled. I was a big fan of the show Orange is the New Black. The season when it turned into a private prison, I would get phone calls from friends of mine that were like, oh my God, is that really what happens? Can they really do that? And one of the things that I appreciated about that season of the show was that it really shined a light on the things that happen inside a facility when it's a private prison. And I'm not saying all private prisons are bad, although I have my own views about that. But the more people learn about what happens, the more people get upset about the inequities and then get moved to do something. And so, I would say learn about what's going on. And then, I mean, there are so many like community organizations and nonprofits whose, their whole goal is to, to fight inequities in the system, whether that's getting marijuana offenders out of prison, whether that's like changing, bail reform, changing monetary bail. There's so many nonprofits out there that are doing really good work to try to change the system. And, the thing that they need is support. The thing they need is help and money and body and resources. And sometimes those resources are just time. But a lot of people, it's definitely, I think corrections in this country is definitely an out of sight, out of mind thing. We don't pay attention, very much to what happens in prisons because we don't see it.
Until it happens to you.
Right. And that's the thing, I've been asked a couple different times about criminal justice reform. And I mean, I've been doing this kind of work for 20 years. Yeah. That's work that would be considered criminal justice reform work. And it's just been in the last, I would say 5 to 10, when this whole, criminal justice reform has become this like political buzzword, and people on both sides have really kind of committed to it. And on the more liberal or Democrat side, it's generally from this sort of moral, like, we need to fix the system, it's broken. From the Republican side, it's also like the system is way too expensive and like it's not doing things the right way. So regardless, like there's a lot of support behind reforming the criminal justice system. But the other thing that we don't talk about that often, that I think is really behind reform and people's support for reform, is that the system has changed and expanded so much. There are very few people whose families have not been touched by the criminal justice system. Back in the 60s and 70s, and even 80s to some degree, the criminal justice, it was people, I think, the general public had a very us versus them perspective. It's like, oh, we're like the law abiding people and those criminals over there, that sort of thing. But then, the drug war, getting tough on crime, changes in drunk driving laws, all of these different things happened now that if you think about, almost everybody, I think, knows someone who's been arrested, who's been on probation or parole or been in jail. Almost everyone. And so when this went from being us versus them to, oh, my brother got arrested, but he's not a bad person. But look at all of these horrible things that happened to him because he got arrested. Because it started to touch so many more people, and they started to be impacted. That's when people really started to pay attention to what was happening and started to pay attention to the inequities. So, I mean, I think, obviously the downside is we have way too many people involved in criminal justice, and lots of them shouldn't be. But that involvement, I think, has also started to shine a light on the inequities in the system and gotten more people involved in it. So it's kind of the experiential learning piece, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about that, but really all of us, not all of us, but probably the vast majority of people are criminals to some degree, whether you've gotten locked up or not, because it's just whether you got caught or
whether
not.
You've been caught.
Yeah. And this, man, we need to do like a part 2 if you're open to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just thinking about like going even further beyond, more recent decades of the criminal justice system, but how the enslavement period still exists in a sense because of the 13th Amendment. And while that quote unquote freed the slaves, let's talk about what happens when you then enter the criminal justice system and how the 13th Amendment no longer applies.
No longer protects you. There's a movie I used to show in my corrections class. It's a great National Geographic produced documentary called The Farm. And it's called The Farm. The subtitle is Life in Angola Prison. So Louisiana is one of, and I don't remember if this has changed. I need to check, but for a long time was one of the only states that instituted true life sentences. So in most places, a life sentence has like a number attached to it. Louisiana had true life sentences, where if you were sentenced to life, that meant that you were going to die in prison. You were going to be in prison until you died. And Louisiana has one of the largest prison systems in the country. They incarcerate a lot of people. Most of the people that they incarcerate are Black. And Angola is a prison that used to be a plantation.
Wow.
And for me, and so they call it The Farm because they have a farm on the lands that used to be worked by slaves are now worked by people who are incarcerated at Angola prison. And so they grow their own food and all of this stuff. And they give people jobs where they make like 15 cents or something ridiculous
a day
an hour
or whatever.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so one of the scenes, the first time I watched that movie, the scene that gripped me the most, and I think it hits exactly to what you were talking about when we look at the history of slavery and how that translates into what we see in the criminal justice system now, is a picture of Angola when it was a plantation. And so there are all these slaves picking cotton and who are all Black, and these slave overseers on horseback with rifles, like watching them, right? That picture, that black and white picture, fades out into a color picture of Angola today, with incarcerated men working those same fields, all Black, white corrections officers on horseback with shotguns watching over them. And it's one of those, like, the more things change, the more they stay the same moments. That they just took, they took a plantation and turned it into a prison. And the only thing that changed was what you called the people who were there, whether they're slaves or inmates, whether they're overseers or corrections officers. That's the only thing that's changed. And that, for me, it just was, that scene was really jarring for me.
It's powerful. It's extremely powerful. Charlene, I literally cannot thank you enough. And first of all, we need to get together again, but
yes, we do.
On a regular basis. And second of all, we do need to do a part 2 of this to get into that, because this is absolutely incredible. And I really appreciate your time. And I can't wait to hear some feedback from everyone as they've listened to this episode, and maybe some hearts change, some minds change. And we'll look forward to doing this again soon. For sure. Yeah. I can't wait. Perfect. Well, you enjoy the rest of your day. Okay. Thanks. You too. Thanks. I love this so much. This is so good. Oh my gosh.